go and resolve the theories concerning society, the political process, the voting process, and what you're going to read in most of the classical sociology literature. Read these books and you're going to see that they're trying to explain society through type of public figures, which also do believe are not as important in public roles anymore than they used to be. First of all, the figure, go back to the literature, even in the middle of the 20th century, I'm not talking about the classical 19th century. Everybody's going to talk about the figure of the citizen, it's a kind of very well-defined classical figure, the figure of the worker, the figure of the soldier, some of the most interesting stories in the stories of soldiers in the army is the place where you started the army of the modern society, for example, going even to the Bulgarian tradition. Ivan Kaczynskis and others basically wrote ahead you're going to see the army as one of the places where you're trying to understand how society functions. And also, of course, you have the problem of the reader. Classical figure, the newspaper reader, go back and read how many times people are going to make different studies and trying to correlate how often you read newspapers and basically where your position in society stands. My claim is that now it's very difficult to try to explain, to describe the society which we live in this type of classical figures of 20th century. Democratic capitalism. You're going to see a kind of other figures being slightly more important. Or some of these classical notions like the citizen are slightly changing their position. And by the way, immigrant was also a very important figure in classical sociology, but I'll go to this back. So first of all, worker, difficult. We made a study here in the country asking people to identify themselves, so we're not telling them who they are, if they should describe their position. Only 4% describe themselves as workers. Worker has disappeared as a self-identification. Not that there are not people working in this country, I tell you work. But basically the classical figure of the industrial worker who is well-organized, member of the trade union and so on. It's very much disappeared. What you're going to see here, this is not kind of a major identification for making people participate in the public life. The figure of the soldier also changed a lot because now we move to the professional armies, and this figure of a citizen soldier is not simply here. When you go to the reader, by the way, the reader was a very important figure for the very emergence of the notion of universal human rights. It is a beautiful book, which I strongly recommend you if you have time and interest to read. It's by a historian of the French Revolution, Lincoln. It's called The Invention of Human Rights. And she makes a point, very much based on a profound study of the history of the French 18th century. And her major claim is that it was the popular novels of the 18th century that made the idea of universal human rights possible. Because when the popular novels appeared, for the first time people started to have the empathy and to identify with people who are very different than them. For example, there was a very famous 18th century novel about a maiden, a love story of a maiden. And normally in this kind of a very traditional societies where everybody knows his own role, it was not easy for the aristocrat to identify with the problems of the maiden, or from the high society maiden to the so-called peasant and so on and so on. But they started to do it. And through reading the novels, they started to discover the others as human like us. And it was very much this phenomenon of mass reading of novels, not so much of newspapers, philosophers, that make the idea of the universal human rights start to be perceived as obvious and natural. Because otherwise, we're never going to understand this paradox, how it was that in the 17th century, or 18th century, early in the 18th century, the idea of human rights and the universal rights of the people were not obvious to people. Just the opposite. People were very different. For example, just to imagine how well stratified the the pre-modern society it was not that we simply born people, we have been adding people. For example, if you go on the policy of tortures, the different kinds of tortures that could be implemented towards people coming from the different social class. For example, you don't have the right to torture an aristocrat. And even when you're going to assess it, basically the aristocrat is going to be punished and killed. He can be killed by a specific way, not the way you kill the peasant. So we're talking about a very strongly stratified society, and then, surprisingly, in the period of 30, 40, 50 years, everybody's starting to believe that human rights are universal. And I believe that this phenomenon in popular literature is something that is not very much noticed in the classical stories of how human rights came. So, but basically also the reader. You know what is the level of reading today. And especially when you see to what extent people go through literature to identify and to share their experiences. This is not very much the case. We can talk about the different figures. For example, the figure of the consumer is obviously much more important than the figure of the worker. And I know that also I to talk to you, but if you see the movements and rights where people really participate in consumer rights, and the interesting story is that you can see the movements for the defense of consumer rights, also in democratic and non-democratic countries. The only strong self-organization on the level of rights, for example, in Russia today, is not around classical human rights agenda, it's around the consumer agenda. For example, we have very strong organizations of owners of apartments in the use of this law. There was the only important mass protest in Russia in the last 2 years was when police basically violently abused the rights of a driver, a private driver of a car, and then thousands of other drivers, in the sense of solidarity, between driving for the whole day with their lights. So you get these levels of solidarity, and also you have a much more developed system through the courts and others to defend your consumer rights. You can go, you apply. Well, here now you have a commission, you own the right on the consumer rights. So this is very important. The other thing which I find extremely important, of course, the taxpayer, as you see, totally disappeared as a classical figure. Nevertheless, the politicians from time to time refer to it. And especially when we talk about really rich people, the problem with tax paying is becoming very difficult because we have all these offshore companies. You basically, it's not so difficult as sophisticated to evade even legally paying taxes. So the figure of the investor is now much more dominated the public discourse than the figure of the taxpayer. And of course, the figure of the voter is becoming a very interesting figure because probably later we'll come to this. The voter, which we used to know from the middle of the 20th century, was not simply a voter, he was a party activist. We have a mass parties. We have all these organized voters. They were into the rallies, they're interested in politics, they're keeping their political identity with them, they're reading the specific newspapers, and this simply has disappeared. Basically, the voter volatility, this is when you measure how often people change their vote, voting for a different party. Basically, in Bulgaria in the year 2000, it was 53%. I mean, more than half voted in a different way they voted the last time.